Malaysia is one of Asia's rising economies. The country grew its gross domestic product, GDP, since its independence to become one of the largest in the entire Southeast Asian region. However, there's just one problem with Malaysia, and it's the fact that, despite having a relatively higher standard of living amongst Southeast Asians, the country has failed to become an industrial powerhouse. What is an industrial powerhouse? It is when an economy is driven by robust manufacturing and industrial sectors that contribute extensively to exports, innovation, and economic resilience. For instance, Japan became Asia's powerhouse in the 20th century because of its automotive industry, driven by companies like Toyota, and a strong market presence in the semiconductor industry with companies like NEC and Toshiba. Whereas South Korea had its own entrance into the automotive industry, driven by companies like Hyundai, and also had its own technology companies such as Samsung and LG. Malaysia, on the other hand, had wanted to have the same set of companies. They were eager to become an industrial powerhouse in the 20th century. They had invested massively into the development of their industries. For instance, they had introduced the Perusahaan Automobile Nasional Berhad, Proton, in 1983, which was Malaysia's most notable attempt at fostering an indigenous industry. They had attracted massive amounts of foreign direct investments, where the government of Malaysia back then had given out tax incentives and presented Malaysia as the next low-labor cost nation. You can understand the government investments into this graph right here, called the gross capital formation as a percentage of GDP. It is a data that we collected from the World Bank, and it represents the proportion of a country's GDP that is invested in physical assets like infrastructure, factories, machinery, and other essential resources for industrial and economic growth, and are driven by the government, private sector, foreign investors, and households. As you can see, the gross capital formation has been high prior to the 21st century. In the early 1980s, they were 37% and 38%, respectively. After dropping, they had also increased again in the 1990s. These were no small investments, and to actually show you how big these were, we can compare them to neighboring countries that really failed to have a robust industrial sector like the Philippines. Here, as you can see, the Philippines, with the latest data available in the World Bank, was not heavily investing in gross capital formation. They were half that of Malaysia. You can also dissect Japan's data here. You can see that in the 20th century, they were investing heavily into this gross capital formation. But as economic troubles emerged and global trends shifted, gross capital formation fell for both Malaysia and Japan, due to stronger competitions from the likes of China, as well as a transition into a more service-oriented economy. The fall in gross capital formation for Malaysia then meant that the country is allocating fewer resources toward building the necessary infrastructure and industrial capacity to sustain long-term economic growth. Secondly, you can also see the export of goods and services as a percentage to the GDP of Malaysia, to better understand how the fall of capital formation impacted the country. As you can already see from the graph right here, data that we gathered from the World Bank, the export of goods and services to GDP was more than 100% in the late 1990s to early 2000s. It had increased fast and big from the 1980s. But as we knew from earlier data, Malaysia had decreased its capital formation, which led to a slowdown in the growth of exports in goods and services. Of course, it would be an oversimplification just to say that this is all because of a decrease in capital formation. There are other factors at play here as well, like global trade dynamics, competition, and other political and trade policies. However, because Malaysia was investing less into its infrastructures and factories, one can arguably see how this underinvestment in production capacity, infrastructure, and innovation had been amongst the contributing factors in shaping Malaysia's export performance during this period. So, you might understand where we are getting at. It's all because of the low investments into capital formation that led to a decline in Malaysia's status as an industrial powerhouse, right? Well, of course, it's arguably a huge critical part to the cause, but it's not just that. There's a lot more important factors that have played a key role in Malaysia's inability to become an industrial powerhouse. But we'll talk about some of the most important ones we see. One of them is a concept called export discipline. Export discipline happens when governments provide support to industries, such as subsidies, tax incentives, and access to credit, on the condition that these industries demonstrate their ability to compete in global markets. One key example here is South Korea. South Korea had tied financial support to export performance, ensuring that only firms that could compete internationally received continued assistance. Malaysia, unfortunately, failed to adopt export discipline as a cornerstone of its industrial policy. While true that the government had provided incentives to promote manufacturing, these were often indiscriminately distributed without tying them to performance metrics. This allowed domestic firms to focus on protected local markets rather than striving for global competitiveness. You can clearly see this from the growth of exports of goods and services from both nations. Here's a graph with data that we collected from the World Bank. You can see just how much exports were growing in South Korea from 1960 to 2000. As a matter of fact, if we take a look at the exports of goods and services from the World Bank, which we recalculated into billions, we get to see this. In the 1970s, South Korea and Malaysia were exporting the same amounts at roughly around $3 billion. Yet just a few decades later, the difference started to emerge, and by the year 2000, South Korea's exports had grown to over $195 billion, whereas Malaysia had only been $112 billion. As we mentioned earlier, a key part of this is because of good export discipline in South Korean firms. Now, thirdly, one of the most important reasons that we see why Malaysia failed to become an industrial powerhouse is seen in their automotive industries. Both Proton and Perodua, the two flagship automotive companies, were envisioned as the pillars of Malaysia's industrial ambitions. They were meant to symbolize the country's transition into high-tech manufacturing, similar to South Korea's Hyundai or Japan's Toyota. Unfortunately, while they succeeded in their local markets, they failed to enter and compete globally. The cause for their incompetence globally is because of over-reliance on protectionist policies. Proton, for instance, was the first national car company that was launched in 1983 under the leadership of Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad. Proton had succeeded partly because of being dependent on protectionist measures such as high tariffs on imported cars and preferential treatment within the domestic market. What this simply meant was that imported cars became significantly more expensive than locally manufactured Proton vehicles, encouraging Malaysians to purchase Proton cars. However, while these policies shielded Proton from competition, they also stifled its drive to innovate and improve quality. While protectionism can be a useful tool in the early stages of industrial development, it must be paired with performance incentives that push firms to compete internationally. In South Korea, for example, Hyundai received similar protections, but the government enforced export discipline, requiring Hyundai to meet export targets as a condition for continued support. Proton faced no such pressures, which led to complacency and an over-reliance on the domestic market. Hence, this is why, as you can see in the graph right here, Malaysia's car companies have such huge market share within their local borders, their exports still remain weak. Fourthly, the most important part of this, as we see, is also because Malaysia has failed to invest heavily into research and development, R&D. This is seen in both Proton and the entire Malaysian economy. Here's a graph with the latest data available published in the World Bank. You can see that, from the latest data available in 1996, Malaysia's R&D expenditure as a percentage of its GDP has been very low as compared to South Korea. This low investment in R&D has had long-term implications on Malaysia's ability to innovate and remain competitive in the global market. South Korea's Hyundai had invested heavily in research and development to develop its own designs and technologies back in the 20th century. Proton, on the other hand, had failed to do the same, and rather than invest in its own technology, they relied on foreign partners for its technological needs. Early Proton models were based on rebadged Mitsubishi designs. This dependence on external partners limited Proton's ability to differentiate itself in the global market. Finally, one of the remaining reasons we can also point to is the reliance on foreign direct investment. Here's a graph on the foreign direct investment, net inflows as a percentage of GDP in both Malaysia and South Korea. You can already tell how well Malaysia has been performing in this category as compared to South Korea. Even in the 1970s, the gap between Malaysia and South Korea has already shown significant differences. So, what's the problem with this? Why didn't FDI result in Malaysia creating a better and stronger economy? Well, one good argument for this is because there were limited technology transfers. It is well known that one of the primary benefits of FDI is its potential to facilitate technology transfer from foreign to domestic firms. In theory, the presence of multinational corporations like Intel, Dell, and Panasonic should allow local businesses to learn advanced production techniques, improve managerial practices, and develop innovative capabilities. However, Malaysia failed to capitalize on this opportunity. Multinational corporations operating in Malaysia often retained proprietary technologies and know-how, limiting their integration with local firms. Unlike South Korea, which implemented policies requiring foreign investors to collaborate with domestic companies and share technology, Malaysia did not impose such conditions. As a result, the technological gap between foreign and local enterprises persisted, stifling the growth of indigenous industries. Now, before we end the video, it is important to answer why Malaysia's economy and its gross capital formation had slowed down in the 21st century. As we can see in the graph right here, which we showed earlier, Malaysia's gross capital formation had dropped in the late 1990s. In contrast, South Korea's gross capital formation, while also experiencing contraction, had still continued to be substantial in the 21st century. So why? Well, in 1997, we saw the Asian financial crisis hit both economies. Both South Korea and Malaysia saw a contraction in their economies, as you can see in this graph right here with data we collected from the World Bank. South Korea contracted by 5.1%, whereas Malaysia with over 7.4%. One of the reasons why after the crisis South Korea continued to perform well in its industrial sector is because the country had responded with aggressive reforms. Whereas Malaysia had implemented strategies such as capital controls and currency pegging, which initially were seen as a well-intentioned response, it was, unfortunately, focused on short-term stabilization rather than addressing long-term structural issues. You can see this in both countries' official exchange rates. Here in the graph, you can see South Korea's official exchange rate to the dollar. Their currency had depreciated from 1997 to 1998 and had continued to trade within similar levels in the coming years. In contrast, Malaysia, after 1997, had pegged the ringgit to the dollar at 3.8 ringgit to a dollar from 1999 to 2005. Unfortunately, there were long-term consequences for doing this. One of them was again inflicting damage on Malaysia's exports. Currency pegs are meant to stabilize one's economy, but they also make a country's exports less competitive compared to countries with more flexible exchange rates. South Korea, for instance, allowed its currency to depreciate, making its goods cheaper in international markets and boosting export-driven growth. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.